It started with the word for the thing you use to open a wine bottle. I was standing in my kitchen, holding it in my hand, looking directly at it, and the word was simply gone. Not hiding, not on the tip of my tongue. Gone. Like someone had reached into a drawer I had opened 10,000 times and quietly removed something while I was not looking. I stood there for a full minute. I said the word in my head the next morning in the shower, and I almost wept with relief. Corkscrew. It was corkscrew. And I remember thinking, okay, it came back. It was just a moment. Everybody has moments. But that was 3 years ago. And the moments have been getting longer ever since. I am 87 years old. And I am not talking about forgetting names. Everyone talks about forgetting names. The neighbor's name, the actor's name, the name of the film you watched last Thursday. People laugh about that. There are jokes about that. Nobody talks about the other kind. The kind where the words for ordinary things start going quiet on you, one by one. Where the language you have lived inside your whole life begins to develop small holes. Where you reach for a word you have used since childhood, and your hand closes on nothing. That kind is different. That kind sits with you differently. And I think it is time somebody talked about it plainly. I was a man who loved language. I want you to understand that about me before we go further. Not in a showy way. I was not a writer or a professor. I was an accountant for most of my working life. But words mattered to me. Reading mattered to me. Conversation. Real conversation, the kind that goes somewhere unexpected and leaves both people a little different at the end. That was one of the great pleasures of my life. I had a vocabulary that my wife used to tease me about, gently, the way she teased me about most things I was quietly proud of. She would say, "Nobody talks like you do." And she meant it as a compliment wrapped in affection. Words were how I thought. Words were how I knew what I was feeling. Words were the architecture of my inner life. And now some of them are missing, and I cannot always find them when I need them. I want to tell you about a man named Walter, who lived 4 houses down from me for 30 years. Walter was 80, a retired high school English teacher, the kind of man who could quote poetry from memory at a dinner table without it feeling like a performance, who chose words the way a craftsman chooses tools, with precision and genuine care. His wife Eleanor told me one evening, about 2 years before Walter passed, that he had started stopping mid-sentence. Not dramatically, not in a way strangers would notice. Just a pause, a brief stillness, and then he would find a different road to the same destination, a different word that was close, but not quite the one he had been reaching for. And Eleanor said she watched him in those pauses, with an expression she had never seen on his face in 40 years of marriage. a flicker of something, not panic, smaller than panic, more private than panic, like a man standing in his own house and noticing, for just a second, that a room he has always known is slightly different than it was, and he cannot say exactly how. Walter kept a small notebook in his breast pocket the last year of his life. Eleanor thought it was for shopping lists. It was not. After he passed, she found it, and she brought it to me because she did not know what to do with it, and she thought I might understand. It was full of words, just words, written in his careful teacher's handwriting, words he was afraid of losing, ordinary words. The word for the feeling of sun on your face through a window, the word for the particular green of new grass in April, words he had used his whole life and was writing down now the way you write down the number of someone you are afraid to forget. He was trying to hold on to them. He was doing it quietly, in a breast pocket notebook, without telling anyone, the way men of his generation handled the things that frightened them most, alone and without fuss. Now here is what people want to say about this. They want to say it is just aging. They want to say it is normal. It happens to everyone. Do your crossword puzzles. Stay mentally active. Drink more water. And maybe all of that is true, and maybe none of it matters, and I genuinely do not know the answer to that. But what I do know is that the conversation almost everyone is having about memory and aging is missing the part that actually matters to the person living inside it. Because this is not really about words. The words are just where it shows. This is about identity. This is about what happens to a person when the very thing they used to know themselves by starts to shift under their feet. When the map you have navigated your entire inner life with starts to have places on it that are no longer clearly marked. And honestly, I want to say something that I have not said to my children or my doctor or anyone who loves me and would worry. There is a grief in this that has no good name, not a dramatic grief, a quiet one. The grief of standing in the middle of your own mind and noticing it is slightly smaller than it was, slightly less reliable, slightly more effortful, and knowing that the direction this goes is not back. You do not grieve this with tears. You grieve it in the small daily moments, the pause before a word that used to come instantly, the sentence you reconstruct around a missing piece, the thought you had clearly in your mind that is dissolved by the time you open your mouth to share it. You grieve it, and then you make your tea, and you sit down, and you keep going, because what else do you do? What else has there ever been to do? I have watched this in different ways across a very long life. I watched my father slow down in his 70s, not dramatically, just a dimming, like a light with a loose connection, still fully himself in every way that mattered, but taking slightly longer to find things, pausing slightly more in conversation. We did not talk about it. Nobody talked about it then. You watched a person navigate it alone and privately, and you pretended not to notice because noticing felt like a cruelty. I watched friends in their 80s start to drift slightly at the edges of long conversations, still sharp and present in short exchanges, but tiring in a way they would never have admitted. And now I am inside it myself, and I understand, finally, why none of them talked about it. Because talking about it means naming it, and naming it makes it real in a way that is very hard to unname. But I think not talking about it is worse. I think the silence costs more than the naming does. Because when you do not talk about it, you are alone in it. And being alone in a frightening thing is the thing that makes it most frightening. So I am talking about it on a video that I would never have imagined making 10 years ago, talking to people I will never meet. Because maybe one of you is sitting somewhere watching this and feeling something you have not been able to name, and you needed to hear that someone else knows what that room feels like. Here is what I want to tell you about living inside this. The words that go quiet first are not always the ones you expect. It is rarely the big words, the complicated words, the ones you were never sure you were using correctly anyway. It is the ordinary ones, the ones so fundamental you cannot believe they require any effort at all. And when an ordinary word goes quiet, it is disorienting in a very specific way, like reaching for a light switch in your own home and finding empty wall. The room is the same. You have been in this room every day of your life. The switch has always been right there. And for just a moment, the familiar becomes uncertain, and you have to stop and locate yourself and find another way. What I have learned is that you find another way. That is the thing I want you to hear most clearly. The mind is more creative and more determined than the loss gives it credit for. You find different roads to the same places. You describe the thing when the name goes quiet. You say the one that opens wine bottles, and your brain files that away, and often enough the word surfaces later, like a piece of wood floating up from the bottom of still water. Corkscrew. You build new habits of language, more patient, more circuitous, sometimes surprisingly more honest and direct than the quick word would have been. You learn to sit inside the pause without panicking. You learn that the pause is not failure. It is just your mind taking a slightly longer route home. I want to say something to anyone who loves someone who is going through this. A parent, a partner, a friend of a certain age. Please do not finish their sentences for them. I know you mean it kindly. I know the pause is uncomfortable, and the impulse to help is genuine and good. But there is a dignity in the finding. There is something important about the person doing their own searching, arriving at their own word, or their own way around the word, completing their own thought. When you jump in, you take that from them. You take the small daily victory of navigating their own mind. Let them pause. Sit with them in the pause. It is not as long as it feels, and it matters more than you know. Walter's notebook is on my shelf now. Eleanor gave it to me after she had held it for a while and decided she wanted it to be with someone who understood what it was. I take it down sometimes, not to read it exactly, just to hold it. Just to think about a man who loved words so much that at the very end of his life, he was still trying to keep them close, writing them down one by one in a breast pocket notebook, refusing to let them go without a fight, which is the most human thing I have ever seen, and the most quietly heartbreaking, and also, somehow, the most beautiful. We all have something like that notebook, something we are trying to hold on to, some version of ourselves we are not ready to release. And I think that holding on, even when it is imperfect and effortful and not always successful, is not denial. It is not weakness. It is love. Love for the life you have lived inside, for the mind that carried you through it, for every word that ever helped you know what you were feeling and say it out loud to someone who needed to hear it. I am 87 years old. Some words are quieter than they used to be, but I still have enough of them to tell you this. And today, that is enough. That is more than enough.